at the recent World Federation conference in Dublin, dementia came up in a number of the presentations and was a topic of discussion everywhere. As we know, it is in every session we always run. My name is Anne Bunning, and I'm the Secretary of the World Federation of Right to Die Societies. I'm also Vice President of our organisation in South Australia, Voluntary Assisted Dying South Australia. With me to discuss this are Tina McCafferty, who's the TEO of Tōtara, I got that, I think, Tōtara Hospice in Auckland, New Zealand, and Emeritus Professor John Willoughby from Flinders University here in South Australia, who's a neurologist and a neuroscientist. To set the scene, I just wanted to sort of remind everybody that dementia is now the leading cause of death for women in Australia and is about to be the leading cause of death overall in Australia. It's the third leading cause of death in New Zealand, so it's not quite the same, but it's going to catch up very soon. And it's one of the awful diseases that is basically not eligible for voluntary assisted dying in the Australian and New Zealand legislation. That's because all of our legislation requires a 6 or 12-month prognosis and decision-making capacity at every stage of the process in relation to assisted dying. The ACT legislation is different and doesn't have that 6 or 12-month prognosis, so we're looking forward to the commencement of that in November next year. But of course, there's no data for that yet because it hasn't commenced. A few months ago, the Australian and New Zealand lobbying groups for assisted dying, we got together and we tried to work out how we could make the legislation available for someone with dementia. And the conclusion we reached, so we put out a big report, and the conclusion was that we need to remove the 6 or 12-month prognosis, which is why it is so exciting that the ACT has already done that, because that would make us almost the same as Canada in their criteria, and it's always been available. Dementia has always been an eligible illness in the Canadian medical assistance in dying legislation. So they've had about 150 people use assisted dying for dementia in their last reporting period. And we would expect something similar in Australia, maybe about 100 a year if we removed the prognosis. So that's where we've headed. But what we're going to do now is have a discussion with two people. Tina is the CEO of Tōtara Hospice in Auckland, New Zealand, as I said. She was born and raised in Glasgow, Scotland, as you will hear, but has made New Zealand her permanent home since 1998. With a 30-year career spanning public sector healthcare, NGO community services and charitable not-for-profits, she is a highly experienced chief executive. And she's been shown all of that time that she's dedicated to empowering a values-based organisation to align people, purpose and performance, ensuring long-term impact. When assisted dying became legal in New Zealand, Tina had worked with her organisation and her board to work out how they were going to deliver it, and they were able to provide a fully integrated assisted dying service when it commenced in New Zealand. So Tōtara now has become one of New Zealand's most values-driven, inclusive and progressive palliative care providers. So Tina, would you be able to just tell us how you prepared for the introduction of assisted dying and what your experience has been?
That's a really big question, and I'm happy to try to synthesise that down. The key question really for us was, is there anything in the values and the intention of assisted dying that would be at odds with our position as a palliative care provider? And so over a number of years, we went through quite deliberate exercises amongst the senior leadership and governance at Tōtara, and we asked ourselves questions about our values, questions about the values of palliative care. We looked at the evidence from other jurisdictions that had VAD or made laws, and we considered those in great depths in both a human rights context, but also in the context that patient autonomy, to have choices as a human being, and to have the patient be the driver of their own healthcare, were fundamentally inextricably linked with our fabric as an organisation. And so after a long process, we found that there was nothing in the values of palliative care that seemed contra to principles or values of autonomy, respect, compassion, collaboration, etc. And we made a decision that palliative care itself as a definition was never supposed to be a static definition, sector or practice. You know, all practices, all industries and all specialities evolve. And we took the position really that we would evolve our palliative care provision in line with the changing norms and expectations of society within a democracy. And so since November 2021, we've had a fully integrated assisted dying support service as part of our palliative care services. And in the years up until law change, that was something that we viewed as a when, not an if. Looking around the world, we made sure that we were in dialogue with all of our stakeholders, our staff, patients, community, volunteers, and that we had the right training, the right processes, and most importantly, the right principles as to why we would support that choice in place.
Yeah, and I understand that you were the only hospice in New Zealand that provided that service. I'm not sure if that's still the case. Can you work out why the others are not providing that service?
It is still the case that we're the only hospice that has a fully integrated service where patients can choose an assisted death as a legal end-of-life option, and our staff will be present and fully support them in that, including on site at our own facilities. Over the years, since 2021, there is 2 or 3 other hospice organisations across New Zealand who have, I think, been watching, and of course the sky hasn't fallen in. There's been no great moral decline or slippery slope. And so they've started to permit and enable assessment for assisted dying eligibility to take place on site, but as yet we're the only ones who will be fully present all the way through the journey with patients. That's our own patients or those patients who seek assistance from us from out of area because their end-of-life choice has been, for a want of a better word, denied to them through other organisations. There appears to be 2 reasons for that. I think one is the ethical difficulty of being able to separate one's kitchen table from one's board table and personal feelings and views from professional ones. And the second one has been in the traditional definition of palliative care itself, which, as we know, is a very long definition with several attributes. But there's one bullet point in that definition: palliative care neither hastens nor postpones death, which has become an almost all-encompassing definition for something that's far more complex. And that may or may not have been used as a soundbite because of the often very faith-based founding history of hospices. But certainly our view is that hospices are a place for all and represent all and should represent all end-of-life choices. And instead of trying to bark at each other across ideologies, we really welcome dialogue and debate and sharing with other hospice providers across the networks.
Okay, thanks, Tina. I'd like to introduce John Willoughby now. Emeritus Professor John Willoughby has had a long career in neurology and neuroscience. He originally trained in neurology at the Royal Adelaide Hospital here in South Australia, then in the UK and later in Montreal in Canada. His training in neuroscience was at McGill University in the Montreal General Hospital Research Institute. John joined Flinders University here in South Australia in 1977. His initial research was in neuroendocrinology, and then from 1995 in epilepsy. He now does research in the advanced analysis of EEG, and following some success, studies of brain signals in people with psychiatric disorders have been possible and are pointing to revealing a biomarker for schizophrenia. John is also the convener of Doctors for Assisted Dying Choice here in South Australia. So we've known him and his work for a very long time. John, before you just talk about your thoughts on dementia, I just wondered if you have any comment on palliative care services and their reluctance. Like, we hear this overall, the palliative care services are reluctant to get involved with assisted dying. Some are, some aren't, and why there's that disparity, with 80 or 90% of people requesting bad being in a palliative care service already.
Well, I've never found a clear answer on that question.
Yes.
I think the history that Tina and you both alluded to of palliative care has motivated against it. So that's been one aspect of it, I think. Religion, of course. And I think some people just don't want to change. They're happy with the way they've got to where they are and they just stay there. So that would, I don't have any magic answer to the question.
Yes, no, there is time. It needs time, yes, and a bit more than time, perhaps. I know you've thought a lot about how assisted dying could be made accessible for a person with dementia. Could you just tell us where you've come to in your thinking at this stage?
Well, I'd be happy to, and I'm really looking forward to Trina's comments on these ideas. Obviously, it would be lovely if people could plan for assisted dying before they become demented and have a tight document that satisfies lots of people. It'll never satisfy everyone, that an assisted death is what this person wants, even after they have lost capacity. Some colleagues in Australia, under the rubric Doctors for Assisted Dying Choice, have prepared a document which includes the signature of the patient while they have capacity, the signature of a guardian, a signature of a JP, and it includes a list of behaviours which, if observed, should activate assisted dying. I can just quickly, I can tell you the list is, I'm no longer able to recognise my closest family or friends. I've become bowel or bladder incontinent. I cannot maintain personal physical cleanliness on my own. It goes on for 10. The last one, I behave in an embarrassing or degrading ways alien to my competent personality, such as shouting, threatening, or exhibiting other unacceptable behaviours. So there are 10 criteria, and the person signing the document can tick as few or as many as they want. And if they happen, they would activate the end of life mechanism. Now, of course, this is just a proposal, but I think something like this in the future would be a huge benefit in the overall management of people with dementia. So I think that's an ideal direction to go. I can't see any real issues in it. So if the patient wants it initially, the family are agreeable and the doctors and the nursing staff have got this document, there should be no hesitation, I'd say. Now, the next and much less satisfactory way to proceed, I would say, is that what we call here my colleagues in South Australia, including Anne, have come up with what we call community-granted assisted dying. And this is when the family, the carers, nursing staff, the medical staff, all agree that this person has no quality of life, and that would enable assisted dying. Now, this is often the case. People end up in palliative care environments without a plan for how they want to die. And so the idea would be, if the community of people looking after them agree that this is the right, proper, ethical, compassionate thing to do, then that should be permitted. Now, that would be a nightmare to legislate, but that's the plan. That's the proposal. Now,
that's if you don't have a plan ahead.
Correct. Yes.
Yes.
Correct. So planning is obviously, I think, becoming a compulsory. It needs to be everyone. People in late life need to be educated about this and the outcomes if they don't have a plan. Messy. Now, you've got on your list of things to discuss later voluntary stopping eating and drinking, and I think that's a bit relevant here too. But shall I leave that till later?
Yeah, let's deal with that later on. Yeah.
Okay.
Tina, how do you think that would go when you're running an institution, as you are a hospice, with advanced care planning? If you had a list similar to what John was saying and the various people who've supported it, endorsed it.
In the End of Life Choice Act review that's currently underway in New Zealand, I think it's just closed, the clinical team and myself, we made a submission to that. And that was for a number of things, including removal of the gag clause in New Zealand, etc. But specifically related to this, we proposed that an advance directive for dementia be introduced into the New Zealand acceptability criteria. And we did that because at the end of the day, the privilege of this work in a human rights context is about respect for autonomy and the prevention of suffering. And certainly we believe that there is a human right to choose. We do believe that it does take capacity, but there is nothing that says that that capacity cannot be in advance. So we have advanced care planning in New Zealand. However, that holds no legal weight whatsoever. So a person could record over and over and over again what their wishes are, and legally, it doesn't matter. It's a wish list, not an obligation. So we felt that a legal advance directive that had legal weight would be an answer for those people suffering from any form of dementia, where fundamentally they were expressing a wish, just as John has said, if in this circumstance, we would like the option for an assisted death. And listening to John, I think that there is a room beyond the written record. We live in a contemporary digital world. And I think it would be really useful if the person with a dementia diagnosis, whilst they've still got capacity, or prior to any diagnosis, was to actually digitally record their wishes, to speak to camera, to have people present and to have that signed off by a lawyer, I think that that is a very powerful way to express someone's wishes actually from them. Could be followed up with, with a written document, but I think we shouldn't overlook the power of digital presence in expressing our wishes. So I fully agree with you about an advance directive. And I also agree that it's just the way that the world is, and we are obligated to plan, and we have to educate people about what can happen in the absence of planning wishes. I don't see in the immediate future a group of clinicians, no matter how well intended, finding their way comfortably around community granted assisted dying. I think that in the conversations that the many conversations I have with clinicians across the board, even the most compassionate clinicians have an ethical worry and concern about it not being the person's wish. And I'm not sure how in a community granted way, even with the best of intention to relieve suffering, that would find its way comfortably over the line in the immediate few years.
Okay. One of the difficulties we have with advanced care planning, and at least they're legal in Australia, so they do have legal status. But when we looked at the data from Canada and from the Netherlands, for example, the Netherlands has had legislation since 2002. And in the last year, there were 9,000 deaths from their assisted dying. Only 336 were people with dementia, even though it's been allowable since in the whole 2 decades. And only 8 of those were people without capacity. So and in Canada, they now have a waiver of final consent. So if you're about to lose capacity, you can sign an agreement once you've already been assessed as eligible for MAID in Canada. You can sign an agreement with your doctor, and then it can proceed on a particular date if you lose capacity. But even so, the clinicians reported and said when we were in Dublin that mostly people still proceed when they have capacity. And there seems to be something around in the Canadian legislation, definitely the Netherlands, it's the doctor who's determining whether the suffering is bad enough to allow assisted dying to proceed, whereas our legislation is written that suffering, yes, there's suffering, but it's the person decides that none of the treatments to relieve that suffering is acceptable to them, and then they meet the criteria. It's not some other person determining whether your level of suffering is sufficient to warrant an assisted death. So there's differences in our legislation, but it was quite amazing to us because we strongly felt that we should have advanced care directives that allowed assisted dying. But when we looked at Canada and Netherlands, it's hardly anybody who's able to use them. And it seems to be clinicians are the reluctant group. They're not wishing to proceed if the person is not saying, yes, I want you to proceed. Do you have either of you have any ideas how we would address that? So, because most people assume you can put assisted dying in your advanced care plan. They're very surprised when they discover, no, you can't. Have you got any ideas on how we could address that? Because for the future, that seems to be a bit of a barrier. John, do you have any bright ideas on how we address that with clinicians?
Well, I can only give you an account of my own experience where desperate family members seek to have their loved one assisted to die peacefully and quickly. And in that situation, working in a public teaching hospital, I have engaged with the nursing staff, my junior doctors and colleagues, and with the direct input of the family, it's been quite easy to get approval and enact assisted dying. So that's while it's been illegal.
Yes.
So my way of answering your question is that the primary drivers of enabling assisted dying in demented people needs to be the family. What needs to be? I think the family is important, and with a preceding advanced request for assisted dying in dementia, it should be, I would have guessed, a much more frequent thing than you've described from Canada and the Netherlands.
So it's a case of the clinicians being, well, sympathetic to the patient's needs for a start, and then engaging with the family, which is what palliative care is meant to do anyway, isn't it?
But I think I can see that a determined family, a group, brothers, sisters, parents, whatever, as a group, speaking to the doctor should influence things in the right direction.
Yes. Okay. Well, if we turn now to the other way, which is definitely patient controlled, which is the voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. That was proposed in Canada as an alternative when you can't use assisted dying legislation. So, or there were two ways it could be used. One is that you could simply use voluntary assisted eating, stopping eating and drinking, and it would take maybe 2 or 3 weeks. The evidence seems to vary. But the other one was to say that if you chose that, then on day 2, once you stopped eating and drinking, you would become eligible for assisted dying, because that's what's going to happen. The difficulty is that it takes at least 2 or 3 weeks to get through all the process to become eligible for that. And by that time, the VSED process has reached a conclusion. So I'm not sure that the day 2 scenario really applies, but I understand how stopping eating and drinking would do it. But have you got any comment on how that could be used?
Well, were you asking me, Anne?
Yes.
I would set up, if I was in control, I would set up with the person and their family and the medical staff that this person had chosen VSED as their way out, and that the documentation should be prepared as soon as that idea has emerged, so that it is available in time for the VSED. Well, I don't even know if it requires permission for a person to decide not to eat and drink.
No.
So
they could just
do it. Yeah. So I don't know that it requires too much planning. Where did that idea come from, Anne?
Well, there's a guy called Thaddeus Pope who was talking about it in Dublin from Canada. But I understand it is something like Rodney Syme in Melbourne has also talked about it. So that a number of our organisations get asked, what about dementia? And given that it's so hard with the formal assisted dying process because of the prognosis and the requirement for capacity, they say there is another option, which is stopping eating and drinking. So that information is provided. But if for a person who's becoming demented, it may become even harder to proceed with that. I'm not sure if you've had any experience with it, Tina, in your hospice.
Certainly, voluntary cessation of eating and drinking has long been associated with patient deaths, whether that's voluntary or involuntary, because of course there's some disease processes where the body, at certain phases just can no longer actually process food or fluids around that, and as we head towards active death. The thing that I would like to say about cessation of eating and drinking is the more that we understand this as an option, and the more we understand how frequently it takes place, the more compassion respect for autonomy, and desire to relieve suffering, I hope, would emerge from that. Because for no one to starve themselves and to dehydrate themselves on purpose takes enormous fortitude and courage. And let's not pretend to die that way is not kind. It is brutal. And why a system would stand by and be comfortable with one option, but not the other, I just can't understand from the principles of autonomy, respect, compassion, and the right of the patient to choose. And I think we need to use the brutality of BSED to try to get the law changed with the harsh reality of what we're actually talking about and what actually occurs.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, yes. I just wanted to talk to you about this prognosis thing that we've got in all of our legislation. The reality is that to remove it, we need a parliament to amend legislation. They put it in as a safeguard, you know, somehow it's a massive safeguard, but the evidence is that it's not a very reliable or effective safeguard. For a start, it's not accurate, like a few weeks ahead of your death, maybe, and a few years it might be, but anywhere in between is incredibly unreliable and inaccurate. So in what sense is it a useful safeguard? Do you have any ideas on how we might approach members of parliament to get them to see that this is not a safeguard? Do you think there would be doctors or nurses or institutional managers who would be prepared to understand assisted dying, but say this is not an effective safeguard and it's a very difficult thing for people often to get?
We would.
Tina, do you want to? Yeah. Do you want to?
We certainly would do that from Tōtara, and in fact, we have made that submission. It is just a reality that even with the best intention, you know, prognosis is both an art and a science, and the further out it is, the less accurate it is. With the best of intention, even with the most, you know, ethically burdened doctor, he or she's not going to get that right all the time. You know, there's concern there. You also have the small minority who will use the requirement for a prognostic period to never allow someone to access bad, because that's not in their personal beliefs. And I think we would be naive to think that that doesn't occur. And then the third thing about suffering is, well, if we, certainly in our legislation, suffering and intolerable suffering is defined by the patient. So a prognostic period, what use does that have there? If the patient has a terminal illness and meets all other criteria, it seems cruel and unnecessary to determine that you have to endure that for X amount of time. There's many different acts across different jurisdictions that require no time frame, and certainly our submission has been to remove the prognostic period and to leave it as suffering. It is unfortunately something that has been politically horse traded, and not just our parliament, but you know, a number of parliaments to get a bill over the line as an act, and I can understand that level of political negotiation. But again, at the centre is a person who is suffering. And I think we've got enough evidence from New Zealand to remove it.
Yeah. Yes, it wasn't in your original act. It only came in
because people,
to get them to vote. Yes. John, do you have any views on how we get members of parliament to see that the prognosis is not helpful and not realistic, not practical?
Well, you've said the magic word, members of parliament. 90% of people are stupid, so there'd be quite a few of them stupid too. It boggles the mind that, I mean, it's so beautifully expressed by Trina now, it's just purely callous. I see nothing of benefit in it at all. And I'd be happy to say that to any politician. But I think we already did, and it didn't work.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I hear from people in South Australia that there's one doctor who consistently gives everybody 7 months. So he never goes lower than 7 months. And if you come back next month, you've still got 7 months, and the next month still. So it just is it's a barrier, and a barrier that serves no purpose. Okay. So yeah, John?
That person should be in jail.
Yeah, yes. Well, the gag clause was the other thing I was going to say, which is a limitation. And I know Gary Payinda from New Zealand, the emergency doctor, said, if I have a patient and I say, well, there's chemotherapy and radiotherapy that you might like to choose or use for your illness, and the person says, isn't there some surgery that I could use? Oh, yes, there is, but I'm not allowed to talk to you about that until you mention it. And he said, if I said that to a patient, I would be struck off. But that is the situation with assisted dying. I can mention all myriad of things, but I'm not allowed to mention assisted dying as one of your legal end-of-life options. So there are several areas. Victoria, New South Wales, and Victoria, South Australia, and New Zealand are the only ones in our jurisdictions that have that limitation. So the others are better off. Could I just talk to you to sort of conclude our discussion? Where do you think realistically that we would be in 10 years? Where do you hope we would be, and where do you think we will be when you put your practical hat on? Tina, do you want to?
Where I hope we will be is a far more compassionate, far more equitable law here in New Zealand. Within Australia, I would love to look over the water to see that each of the states in Australia had the same law, and we could look to learn and apply that equity closure. I hope that the evidence continues to show in New Zealand that certainly you're talking at less than 1% of all deaths. There's not an enormous tsunami. There's not this imaginary slippery slope that everyone is going down. Certainly just people who meet certain criteria, who are suffering, are able to control in their wishes the time, place and manner of their inevitable death. And if that was extended to include other conditions of suffering, I think it would be a more compassionate law. I think we may get the gag clause removed, which would be a great step forward for equity. And it would also help clinicians not to end up in dissonance with the own requirements of their practice. And I hope that the evidence shows that increasingly compassionate law is used appropriately, which I believe it will be as it is now. I think that we need some brave politicians, and the only way that politicians act is to hear the voice of people who put them in seats. And we must continue to advocate, communicate, and educate the general public and all of those who voted that this activist movement for the rights of human beings to choose options at the end of their life is far from over with the implementation of one Act of Parliament, and we need to keep evolving.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. John, where do you think we'll be and where do you hope we'll be?
Well, where I hope we'll be is that people can choose, as Trina's already said, I keep on referring to that, the time, place and method of their deaths. And the politicians I think need to be called out in the way that I'd like to call them out for being foolish and callous. They're the two descriptions that apply to these two restrictions that we've got on our legislation at the moment. That needs to become an election issue, I think. But I'd like there to be a much easier road for people to take at this end of life stage. I don't see it happening easily. I mean, as you know, Anne, it took 16 attempts to get legislation through successfully in South Australia. Maybe 8 this time to remove the prognosis and the prognosis and the gag clause. Yes, I mean, I must say that in my personal dealings with people, I ignore the gag clause. It's just impossibly wrong that exists. That may be legal, but it's wrong.
Yes. Well, it came from Oregon, and that was just based on funding of hospice care. It was nothing to do with any clinical approach to anything to do with assisted dying. So it just made some MPs feel better to have it in the Victorian Act. And then we've all followed suit. I'd like to really thank you both for being part of this discussion. There's a long way to go, obviously, but the more we talk about it and the more we discuss all the bits around it, it's not straightforward. It's not easy. It's going to take a lot of combined effort, as you said, Tina, a lot of campaigning and a lot of work. So thank you very much for the discussion, and hopefully we'll have a lot more public discussions about this. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Yes.
Thank you.